And then we're going to hear some music from Janice Rowland.
One way to think about the three components of scarcity and how they influence culture is to reflect upon the following questions. As you're reading the questions, it's helpful to keep in mind any culture or social system that you're a part of, whether your classroom, your family, your community, or maybe your work team. 1. Shame. Is fear of ridicule and belittling used to manage people and/or to keep people in line? Is self-worth tied to achievement, productivity, or compliance? Is perfectionism an issue? 2. Comparison. Healthy competition can be beneficial, but is there a constant overt or covert comparing and ranking? Has creativity been suffocated? Is there an ideal way of being or one form of talent that is used as measurement of everyone else's worth? Disengagement is number 3. Are people afraid to take risks or to try new things? Is it easier to stay quiet than to share stories, experiences, and ideas? Does it feel as if no one is really paying attention or listening? Is everyone struggling to be seen and heard? When I look at these questions and think about our larger culture, the media, and the socio-economic political landscape, my answers are yes, yes, yes. When I think about my family in the context of these questions, I know that these are the exact issues that I work to overcome every single day. I use the word overcome because to grow a relationship or raise a family or create an organizational culture or run a school or nurture a faith community, all in a way that is fundamentally opposite to the culture norms driven by scarcity, it takes awareness, commitment, and work every single day. We're called to dare greatly every time we make choices that challenge the social climate of scarcity. The counter approach to living in scarcity is not about abundance. In fact, I think abundance and scarcity are two sides of the same coin. The opposite of never enough isn't abundance or more than enough or more that you can imagine. The opposite of scarcity is enough, or what I call wholeheartedness. There are many tenets of wholeheartedness, but at its very core is vulnerability and worthiness. Facing uncertainty, exposure, and emotional risks, and knowing that I am enough. And now we welcome Janice Rowland to the front to share some special music.
Hello, everyone. Hi, can you hear me okay? All right, so I wrote this song. It's called Love Falls Down. I wrote it in the winter of 2018 into 2019. I'm a kind of person that has some trouble getting through the winter. I know I'm not alone. So I actually wrote this pre-pandemic, but when the pandemic happened, it felt like it was resonating even more. So it's thank you for helping me share my vulnerability with you, and I hope you enjoy. working late all the time. I haven't had the guts to tell you, you've been slipping out my mind. And I fear we're losing touch. I see you struggling, and I wanna reach out my hand, but I'm too buried in my own pain, and I've nothing left to lend. When love falls down, you pick it up. When time slips away, you get in touch. And stone by stone, we build a path. And bit by bit, we learn to laugh. In the dead of winter, neighbors keep to themselves, trees are all bare, and the ground won't give way. Remember the spring, my friend, when new life returns. Remember our summer love, when passion burns. When love falls down, you pick it up. When time slips away, you get in touch. And step by step, we learn to walk. And word by word, we start to talk. Can we learn to heal each other in time? When time falls down, you pick it up. When love slips away, you get in touch. And hour by hour, we learn to be. And day by day, return to me. Thank you.
This is a short homily. Y'all ever seen the movie Encanto? I told you could get Encanto every week if you're not careful. So I want to talk very quickly about brokenness. And I want to talk about woundedness. And I want to talk about vulnerability and courage and what happens when love falls down. There's a song in the movie Encanto called "We Don't Talk About Bruno." We don't talk about Bruno, no. Spoiler alert for Encanto. Bruno is one of the family members who had a falling out with the family, and they think that he has been exiled and he is gone. And so we don't talk about Bruno. It's too painful. It's too close to home. And what they find, that through the journey of their family, a journey of healing and restoration, trying to restore their right relationships with one another, they find that the person they don't talk about, the thing they don't talk about, is actually the key to unlocking everything else. And what they find is that when someone does have the courage to talk about Bruno, they find Bruno. And Bruno has not been exiled, has not been away. Bruno has actually been a part of the family the whole time, even though they didn't see him or recognize him. I cannot recommend this movie enough. You've got to go see it if you have not seen it. But this is the story. And there's a wonderful visual metaphor about healing the cracks of their casita, healing the cracks in the family. And they can't start to heal it because they don't talk about Bruno. So this is a story about secrecy and vulnerability. It's a story about intergenerational trauma. And it's a story about stories. We all have stories. Some of the stories we put on this timeline at the back of the sanctuary. Some of the stories we'll have in our history book. And we have personal stories, right? And if you're like me, you and your family perhaps, you have stories you don't talk about. Our country has stories we don't want to talk about. In any group of people that gets together, you form this system, you form this institution. And there are things that you can see that if you don't know the story about, they don't make sense. And the only way you can know is to hear that story. Churches have this all the time, right? Not just UU churches. There's an unfortunate history of sexual misconduct by ministers in all kinds of denominations. And for a long time, we don't talk about Bruno, right? And we know how that turns out. That doesn't heal the cracks. That doesn't fix the problem, right? If we look at the prison system in America, the prison system in America is where we try to put problems that we don't want to talk about. It's where we try to hide everything away. But that's actually how you tell what the problem is. What needs to be healed is the things that we don't talk about. Here in Unitarian Universalist congregations, we have something called a covenant of right relations. It's how we promise to act and be with one another. We don't say like a Nicene Creed, or we don't have a statement of beliefs here, but we promise to act with one another in ways that are supposed to restore right relationships, especially when we mess up. That's the beauty of the covenant. That's the best purpose of the covenant. Is what do we do when love falls down? What do we do when we make mistakes? Do we not talk about Bruno? Or do we find ways to do the reparations, to do the restoration work? We talk about our mission here at UU Mount Airy is to build beloved community by embracing all souls and nurturing wholeness. So here's the kicker, friends. When we don't want to tell the hard parts of our story as individuals, as groups of people, as a country, when we don't want to wrestle with those parts of our history that we try just to not talk about and not deal with, when we don't want to do that restoration work, the harm keeps happening. The love keeps falling down and falling away. It doesn't get fixed. Right? And I believe that the purpose of religious life, the purpose of church, is where we come to be human in all of our messiness. The movie Encanto is all about the messiness of this family. That they seem like they're perfect on the outside, the wonderful Madrigal family. But on the inside, they're kind of messy, just like us. There's a story of a UU congregation way back in the 1820s where there was an old patriarch who would sit here in the front, and when it would come time to kneel and pray in the old pew boxes, everyone would get down and kneel and close their eyes, and he would stand up and look to see if everyone was praying correctly, to see if everyone was in their correct seats, to see if people who hadn't been making their tithes had dared to show up. That idea of perfectionism is kind of a part of our cultural DNA. America is the greatest nation ever, and we have to make it great again. So often when we tell these stories, when we try and tell the real histories, people can react emotionally. People can react defensively. You ever seen anyone react emotionally or defensively to talking about the history of this country? We don't talk about Bruno, and if we don't talk about it, it'll just get better on its own. So this is not a history lesson, and me telling you to talk about our stories that can be hard to wrestle with. It's not saying we're just blabbing all of our stuff to everyone. And it's not saying that we're out here to blame people. If you've had a misunderstanding with someone, this is not about saying, me and Shay had a fight the other day, and she was so wrong, and she said something so mean that I just hope she gets what's coming to her. Because the blame or the guilt reaction, that's what we see all the time, right? That when we tell our stories, that it's not about assigning blame or guilt. It's about telling a full story. It's about talking about the things where the cracks are. Because that's how the healing happens. To learn from our history and do better. To learn from the mistakes in my life and do better. Not to be perfect, because if there's one thing I have learned in ministry, for which I am grateful, is that God is God and I am not. I don't have to be perfect, thankfully. And I'll remind you of that. I don't have to be perfect, and neither do you. Because the opposite of this scarcity is not perfection. It's simply being enough. So when we tell our stories, the reason for doing this exercise in vulnerability, to think about our stories individually, to think about our stories collectively, is to make space for our human messiness. To tell our old stories so that we can also tell the new one. To not just tell the story of who we were, but of who we are and who we're becoming. And to do the restoration work and the reparations work that helps heal those cracks. Because if our mission is building beloved community, that cannot happen without restoration. It cannot happen without reparations. It cannot happen without doing the emotional labor work of telling our stories and wrestling with our messiness, of tending to our brokenness. That's the only way it can happen. So when your inclination is like me to not talk about Bruno, to not talk about our woundedness, our brokenness, our Bruno-ness, perhaps, when our inclination is to feel guilt, to hold one another in blame, when love falls down, we can do something else. We can tell our story with courage and vulnerability, and we can start doing the healing work of repairing those cracks. To tell our whole messy human story of how we have changed and failed and tried again and come back to the table through our covenant, and how we have loved one another into wholeness, helped heal one another, how we nurtured wholeness in one another. What a story that would be. May we help to make it so. Amen. Let's take a second and sit with that. Thank you, friends. I invite you to consider the stories that you need to tell as an individual, as part of this congregation, as part of your family, and to meditate on that as we take our offering here in the sanctuary and online. There are instructions on how to give online on our slides, and they're on our website.